If you say one word about this, Ethan, you will regret it. That's what Karen Mitchell from HR told me last Tuesday at 3:40 p.m., sitting across from me in a glass conference room that suddenly felt about 10 degrees colder than the rest of the office. Up until that moment, I honestly believed HR was there to protect employees like me. I had been with Reynolds and Clark Technologies for 3 years, working as a project analyst, pulling 60-hour weeks during product launches, answering emails at midnight, doing everything I thought a loyal employee was supposed to do. I wasn't a troublemaker. I wasn't political. I kept my head down, hit my deadlines, and assumed that if something ever went wrong, the system would handle it. That illusion cracked the day I stumbled across expense reports that didn't add up. It started simple. I was reconciling quarterly budgets for our software division when I noticed repeated client entertainment charges tied to David Reynolds, our senior director. We're talking thousands of dollars at high-end steakhouses and luxury boxes at NBA games, all labeled as strategic partnership meetings. The problem was, the clients listed either didn't exist in our CRM or hadn't worked with us in over a year. At first, I figured it was a clerical error. I even double-checked the spreadsheets twice, assuming I'd missed something. But the deeper I dug, the worse it looked. The totals crossed into 6 figures over the last 18 months. That's not a rounding mistake. That's a pattern. I brought it up casually to my coworker, Emily Carter, the only person in the office I trusted. She stared at me for a long second and said, "Ethan, you don't want to go down that road." When I asked why, she just shook her head. "David's untouchable. He brings in revenue. People who challenge him don't last long." I told myself that couldn't be true. This wasn't some shady startup operating out of a garage. We had compliance training every quarter. We had anonymous reporting channels. We had posters in the break room about integrity. So I did what those posters said to do. I scheduled a meeting with HR. Karen Mitchell listened carefully as I walked her through the documents. She nodded, took notes, thanked me for my professionalism. She even said, "We appreciate employees who speak up." I walked out of that first meeting feeling relieved, like I'd done my civic duty. 2 days later, she asked me to come back. That's when the tone changed. The blinds were partially closed this time. Her smile was thinner. She folded her hands on the table and said, "We've reviewed your concerns." Then she paused, studying my face. "There are context factors you're not aware of." I asked what that meant. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she leaned forward and lowered her voice. "For your own good, Ethan, stay quiet. This could seriously damage your career here." I remember feeling my heartbeat in my ears. I asked if the expenses were legitimate. She said, "Leadership handles sensitive matters differently. Not everything is your responsibility." That's when I realized this wasn't about facts. It was about hierarchy, about protecting someone higher up the ladder. I left that room with a strange mix of anger and disbelief. I had followed the rules. I had trusted the process. And now the message was clear: know your place. I sat at my desk staring at my monitor, pretending to work while my mind replayed her words. "Stay quiet. Protect your future." As if my future depended on pretending I hadn't seen what I saw. By the time I packed up at 6:15 p.m. and walked to my car in the parking garage, I understood something I hadn't before. The real risk wasn't speaking up. The real risk was realizing the company I'd given 3 years of my life to didn't want the truth. And for the first time since I started working there, I wasn't sure I could just keep my head down and move on. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the meeting in my head. The way Karen's voice dropped when she told me to think about my future, the way she avoided answering a direct question about whether the expenses were legitimate. I lay there staring at the ceiling of my apartment, watching the red numbers on my alarm clock crawl from 11:47 p.m. to 12:32 a.m. to 1:18 a.m., calculating what would happen if I lost my job. My rent was $1,800 a month. My car payment was $420. Health insurance came straight out of my paycheck. I did not have some massive safety net waiting for me. I had about 3 months of savings. Maybe 4 if I cut everything down to the basics. That is what silence was buying me. 3 or 4 months of security. The next morning at the office, everything looked normal on the surface. People were laughing near the coffee machine. Someone had brought donuts. David Reynolds walked past my desk like he always did, confident, relaxed, talking about a golf outing over the weekend. If he knew I had raised concerns, he did not show it. That almost made it worse. I felt like I was carrying around a secret that everyone else had decided to ignore. Around 10:30, Emily stopped by my cubicle. She leaned against the divider and asked quietly, "So what did HR say?" I hesitated for a second, then told her the truth. I told her they had advised me to let it go, that there were context factors I did not understand. Emily closed her eyes for a moment and exhaled. "I told you," she said softly. "They protect leadership." I asked her if she had ever seen anything like this before. She nodded once. Not exactly this, but enough to know how it works. The rest of the day dragged. Every email notification made my stomach tighten. I kept wondering if I would be called into another meeting, if my system access would suddenly be restricted, if security would show up at my desk. Nothing happened. That silence felt strategic. It felt like they were waiting to see if I would fall back in line. By late afternoon, I opened the expense files again. I told myself I was just double-checking my math, but that was not true. I was looking for certainty. I needed to know I was not overreacting. The numbers were still there. The same dates. The same vague descriptions. The same missing client references. I pulled performance reports and compared revenue tied to those supposed meetings. There was no measurable increase. No new contracts. No signed agreements. Just money flowing out. When I printed a summary sheet, my hands were steady this time. The fear had not disappeared, but it had shifted. It was no longer fear of being wrong. It was fear of what it meant if I stayed quiet. At 5:45, as most of the office started packing up, I saw Karen walk into David's office. The glass walls were frosted halfway up, but I could see their silhouettes. They stood close, talking for several minutes. Then they both laughed. That sound hit harder than any threat. It was casual, comfortable, like there was no crisis at all. In that moment, something clicked for me. I realized that if this went away, it would not be because it was resolved. It would be because it was buried, and I would become part of that burial. I shut down my computer, slid the printed summary into my backpack, and walked out of the building into the cool evening air. The sun was setting behind the office park, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I sat in my car for a full 5 minutes before starting the engine, staring at the steering wheel and asking myself one question I could not avoid anymore. If I stayed silent, what kind of person would that make me? The next morning I woke up with a clarity that had not been there before. The fear was still present, but it was no longer in control. It felt more like background noise, like the hum of an air conditioner you eventually stop noticing. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, around 7:30, when the floor was still quiet and the overhead lights had that sterile glow that made everything look colder than it really was. I logged into my computer and opened a blank document. I stared at the blinking cursor for a full minute, knowing that whatever I typed next could change the trajectory of my career. I started by outlining the facts. Dates, dollar amounts, vendor names. I removed emotion from the equation and focused on documentation. If this ever left my inbox, it needed to be airtight. I attached screenshots of the expense reports and cross-referenced them with revenue data. I saved everything to a secure personal drive, making sure I was not violating any confidentiality policies, but preserving what I had already lawfully accessed as part of my role. Around 8:15, Emily walked in and immediately noticed I was at my desk earlier than usual. She set her bag down and looked at me carefully. "You look like you made a decision," she said. I told her I was not planning to go quietly. I explained that I was considering escalating the issue beyond HR, possibly to the executive board, or even through the anonymous ethics hotline that our compliance training always highlighted. She went silent for a moment, then pulled up a chair. "If you do this," she said slowly, "there is no coming back to normal." I knew she was right. Once something like this moves upward, it creates waves. People start asking questions. Loyalties get tested. I told her I understood. What I did not say out loud was that normal no longer felt acceptable. Around 9:30, I received a calendar invite from Karen titled Follow-Up Discussion. It was scheduled for 11 o'clock. My chest tightened slightly, but instead of panic, I felt focus. This was the moment where I would find out whether they were trying to pressure me further or contain the situation in another way. At 11 sharp, I walked into the same glass conference room. Karen was already there, and this time David Reynolds was sitting beside her. That alone told me everything. Karen began by thanking me again for my diligence. David leaned back in his chair, hands folded, wearing a polite but distant expression. He said he understood there had been questions about certain expenses and that high-level client development often required discretion. He spoke smoothly, confidently, as if this were a minor misunderstanding. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked one simple question. Can you provide documentation that ties those expenses directly to signed contracts or measurable revenue? There was a brief pause. Karen jumped in before David could answer. She said some strategic relationships take time to mature and that not all investments produce immediate returns. It was a carefully constructed response that avoided specifics. I nodded slowly and said I would need formal clarification in writing for audit purposes. That shifted the energy in the room. David's smile faded slightly. Karen's posture stiffened. The meeting ended shortly after with no concrete answers, just reassurances and subtle reminders about team cohesion. When I walked back to my desk, I knew two things. First, they were not going to voluntarily expose anything. Second, they were now fully aware that I was not backing down. I opened the ethics hotline page on our internal website and read the policy again. It clearly stated that retaliation against employees who reported concerns in good faith was prohibited. I copied that section into my notes. Then I drafted a detailed report addressed to the compliance committee and attached every piece of evidence I had organized that morning. My finger hovered over the submit button for several seconds. I thought about my rent, my car payment, the fragile comfort of stability. Then I thought about the laughter I had seen through the frosted glass the night before. I clicked submit. The confirmation email from the compliance committee arrived 12 minutes after I submitted the report. It was automated, polite, and clinical, stating that my concern had been received and would be reviewed confidentially. Seeing it in writing made everything feel more real. There was now a digital record that could not simply be erased with a closed-door conversation. For the rest of the afternoon, I tried to focus on my regular workload, answering client emails and updating forecasting sheets, but I could feel a subtle shift in the air. Around 2:30, my direct supervisor, Mark Sullivan, stopped by my desk. Mark had always been neutral, the kind of manager who cared about metrics and avoided drama. He asked if I had a few minutes to talk. We stepped into a smaller meeting room near the break area. He closed the door gently and sat across from me. I have been told you filed a formal complaint, he said carefully. He did not sound angry, but he did sound concerned. I told him that I had reported discrepancies in expense documentation and that I believed it was the responsible thing to do. He nodded slowly and said, "You need to understand the timing here. We are entering a critical quarter. Any instability at the leadership level could impact investor confidence." That word stood out to me. Investors, not employees, not compliance. I asked him directly if he believed I had done something wrong. He paused for several seconds before answering. "I think you should have handled it internally," he said. I reminded him that I had gone to human resources first. He did not respond to that. Instead, he leaned forward and lowered his voice. "There are politics at this level that you are not aware of. Sometimes the bigger picture matters." I left that conversation with a clearer understanding of what I was up against. It was not just one director or one human resources manager. It was a structure designed to protect itself. By the end of the day, I noticed small but noticeable changes. I was removed from a strategy meeting that had been on my calendar all week. An email thread about budget planning suddenly no longer included me. No one said anything directly, but exclusion can be loud without making a sound. Emily noticed it too. She sent me a message asking why I was not in the conference room with the rest of the team. I told her I had not been invited. She responded with a single word, "Wow." That evening, as I packed up my laptop, Karen approached my desk. She smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes and asked if we could speak briefly. We stood near the windows overlooking the parking lot. She said the compliance committee had received my submission and that an internal review would begin immediately. She emphasized the word internal. Then she added, "During this process, it is important that you maintain professionalism and avoid discussing this matter with colleagues." I understood the message beneath the surface. Isolation. Containment. Control the narrative. I told her I had nothing to hide and that I would continue performing my job as expected. She studied my face for a moment, as if trying to measure how far I was willing to go. "These situations can become complicated," she said. "Careers can be affected in ways people do not anticipate." I met her gaze and replied calmly, "So can reputations." For the first time, she did not immediately respond. There was a flicker of something in her expression, maybe irritation, maybe calculation. She simply nodded and walked away. As I drove home that night, traffic crawling at 20 miles per hour on the freeway, I realized the real battle had begun. The report was only the first move. What happened next would determine whether the policies printed in our employee handbook actually meant something or whether they were just decorative words on glossy paper. And despite the quiet pressure building around me, I felt something unexpected growing stronger than fear. I felt resolve. The following week felt like living under a microscope. No one said anything directly, but the atmosphere had changed in ways that were impossible to ignore. Meetings that I used to lead were reassigned. Projects that required financial oversight were shifted to other analysts without explanation. My access to certain shared folders was quietly reduced. When I asked the information technology department about it, they told me it was part of a temporary restructuring. That word temporary sounded carefully chosen. I documented everything. Dates, times, screenshots of access denials, copies of calendar removals. If this was subtle retaliation, I wanted a record. On Wednesday morning, I received an email from the compliance committee requesting a formal interview. It was scheduled for Friday at 9 o'clock with 2 members of the internal audit team and an external legal consultant. The fact that outside counsel was involved surprised me. That meant the situation was serious enough to warrant independent oversight. For the first time since submitting the report, I felt a small shift in balance. Maybe the system was not entirely designed to bury concerns after all. On Friday, I walked into a larger conference room on the executive floor, a place I had never been invited before. The room overlooked the city skyline, all glass and polished wood, the kind of space meant to signal authority. The audit director, a man in his late 40s named Richard Coleman, greeted me with a firm handshake. Beside him sat a woman introduced as Laura Bennett, external counsel retained to advise on compliance matters. Their tone was professional, neutral, not defensive. They asked me to walk through everything from the beginning. I explained how I discovered the discrepancies while reconciling quarterly budgets, how I cross-referenced vendor names with client records, and how I initially approached human resources before escalating the issue. They asked precise questions about data sources and access permissions. I answered calmly, sticking to facts. At one point, Laura asked whether anyone had suggested I remain silent about my concerns. I hesitated for half a second, then repeated Karen's words as accurately as I could remember them. There was no visible reaction from either of them, but Richard made a note and underlined something on his legal pad. The interview lasted nearly 90 minutes. When it ended, Richard thanked me and said the committee would conduct a full review, including interviews with relevant leadership. He emphasized that retaliation against employees who report in good faith violates company policy and federal guidelines. Hearing that stated plainly in that room felt different than reading it in an employee handbook. It sounded official. On my way back to my desk, I noticed David standing near the elevators. He looked at me longer than usual, his expression unreadable. He did not say a word, but the silence between us felt heavier than any conversation. By that afternoon, rumors had started circulating. I overheard fragments near the coffee machine about an audit review and executive scrutiny. Emily texted me from across the floor asking if it was true that external lawyers were involved. I simply replied, yes. The shift in energy was undeniable now. People who had avoided eye contact earlier in the week were suddenly more cautious, more observant. Late that day, Mark called me into his office again. His tone had softened compared to earlier conversations. He asked how the interview went and whether I felt supported. The question felt almost ironic. I told him I had provided factual information and that I expected the process to unfold objectively. He nodded and said, "These things can escalate quickly." I looked at him and replied, "So can consequences when issues are ignored." He did not challenge that. As I drove home that evening, the freeway moving at a steady 55 miles per hour, I realized the situation had crossed a threshold. It was no longer a quiet internal matter between me and human resources. It had entered a formal review process with legal oversight. Whatever happened next would not be decided in whispered conversations behind frosted glass. It would be documented, examined, and measured. And for the first time since this began, I felt that the pressure was no longer resting entirely on my shoulders. By the beginning of the third week, The office felt divided in a way that no official memo could ever capture. Conversations stopped when certain people walked by. Calendar invites were sent with more people copied than necessary, as if everyone wanted witnesses. The compliance review had clearly expanded beyond a simple expense check. On Monday morning, an all-staff email from the executive team announced that an internal financial audit was underway to ensure alignment with company policy and regulatory standards. It did not mention names, but everyone knew where it started. I read the email twice, noticing how carefully it was phrased. Words like transparency and accountability were highlighted, as if they had always been part of the culture. Around noon, Emily came to my desk looking both nervous and energized. She whispered that she had been contacted by the audit team as well. They wanted to ask whether she had ever been instructed to categorize expenses in a specific way or bypass documentation steps. I told her to tell the truth, nothing more and nothing less. She nodded and said she planned to. That afternoon, I was unexpectedly added back to a strategy meeting I had previously been removed from. When I entered the conference room, David was already seated at the head of the table. He looked composed, but there was a tightness around his eyes that had not been there before. Mark avoided direct eye contact with me, focusing instead on the slide deck projected onto the screen. The meeting proceeded in a strained but controlled manner. At one point, David asked for an update on budget projections. When it was my turn to speak, I delivered the numbers clearly and concisely, maintaining a professional tone. There was no confrontation, no dramatic exchange, just data. But beneath the surface, everyone understood the context. Later that day, I received a second request from the audit committee asking for additional supporting documents, including email correspondence related to client entertainment approvals. I forwarded everything I had. Within an hour, I received a reply thanking me for my cooperation and informing me that several financial controls were being temporarily adjusted pending review. That phrase stood out. Temporarily adjusted. It suggested change was already happening. On Wednesday morning, rumors intensified. Someone mentioned that certain corporate credit cards had been suspended. Another person said that external accountants had been spotted reviewing files on the executive floor. Even Karen appeared less visible than usual, spending most of her time in closed-door meetings. In the afternoon, I was called once again to the large conference room upstairs. This time, the chief executive officer, Michael Thompson, was present. I had only seen him during quarterly town halls, speaking confidently about growth and vision. In person, he was measured and direct. He thanked me for bringing forward concerns and stated that the company took financial integrity seriously. He did not reveal conclusions, but he acknowledged that preliminary findings indicated discrepancies that required corrective action. Hearing that from the highest level of leadership shifted something internally for me. For weeks, I had felt like a single employee pushing against a wall of authority. Now that wall was being examined from the top down. After the meeting, as I walked back through the corridor lined with framed awards and company milestones, I realized the narrative had changed. This was no longer about whether I would be silenced. It was about whether leadership would align their actions with the values they publicly promoted. When I returned to my desk, I noticed an email from Karen requesting a conversation later that week. The tone was neutral, almost cordial. Whatever that meeting would bring, it was clear the balance of power was no longer one-sided. The process I had set in motion was unfolding beyond anyone's quiet control, including my own. The meeting Karen requested was scheduled for Thursday at 4 o'clock, late enough in the day that most people would already be mentally checked out. When I walked into her office, the atmosphere felt different from our earlier conversations. The blinds were fully open this time, sunlight spilling across her desk. She motioned for me to sit, her posture composed but less rigid than before. For a moment she did not speak, as if choosing her words carefully. Then she began by saying that the compliance review had uncovered irregularities in expense documentation that required corrective measures. She did not defend the prior conversations. She did not repeat any warnings about my career. Instead, she said the company was implementing interim controls and that certain leadership responsibilities were being reassigned while the investigation continued. She did not mention David by name, but the implication was clear. I asked directly whether retaliation against me had been formally addressed. She held my gaze and replied that the company policy prohibiting retaliation remained in full effect and that any perceived adverse action would be reviewed immediately. The language was careful, almost rehearsed, but it was a noticeable shift from the tone she had used weeks earlier. After the meeting, I returned to my desk and noticed an unusual quiet across the floor. About 30 minutes later, an email from Michael Thompson appeared in every employee's inbox. The subject line read, "Organizational Update." The message stated that David Reynolds was being placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the financial review, and that an interim director would oversee the division. The email emphasized commitment to transparency, ethical conduct, and accountability. I read it twice to make sure I was not misinterpreting anything. Administrative leave. Those two words carried weight. Within minutes, the office buzzed with low conversations. People were not celebrating, but there was a sense of disbelief. Someone near the break area whispered that they had never seen an executive placed on leave before. Emily walked over to my desk, her eyes wide. "This is real," she said quietly. I nodded. It was real. But along with the validation came a new wave of uncertainty. When power structures shift, they rarely do so without ripple effects. Later that afternoon, Mark called a team meeting to address workflow adjustments. His tone was measured, professional, almost subdued. He acknowledged that the department would experience temporary changes, but assured everyone that projects would continue without interruption. He avoided discussing details about the investigation, focusing instead on operational continuity. As he spoke, I noticed that no one looked at me directly, yet everyone seemed aware of my presence in a new way. It was not hostility. It was awareness. That evening, as I packed up to leave, I received a brief message from Richard Coleman in audit thanking me for my cooperation and stating that the review was progressing constructively. He wrote that transparency from employees strengthens institutional integrity. That sentence stayed with me. Walking through the parking lot under the fading light, I realized that what had started as a quiet internal conflict had transformed into something larger than one set of expense reports. It had become a test of whether the company's stated values would withstand scrutiny. I did not feel triumphant. I felt steady. The outcome was still unfolding, but the silence that once surrounded the issue had been replaced by formal acknowledgement and documented action. Whatever happened next, it was no longer hidden behind closed doors or softened by careful suggestions to protect my own future. The process was visible now, and visibility changes everything. The days following the announcement felt strangely calm, almost like the quiet after a major storm has passed, but before the cleanup begins. David's office remained closed, his nameplate still on the door, but the lights inside stayed off. An interim director from another division stepped in, focusing strictly on operations and avoiding any discussion of the ongoing review. The company moved quickly to reinforce procedures. New approval layers were added to expense submissions. Finance began conducting weekly reconciliations instead of quarterly. Training sessions on compliance were scheduled with mandatory attendance, even for senior management. It was clear that the organization was not just addressing one individual's actions, but examining systemic gaps. A week later, another company-wide email was sent. This time it was more direct. It stated that the financial review had identified significant policy violations related to expense reporting and oversight. Without using dramatic language, it confirmed that certain leadership practices had not aligned with established standards. It also announced that David Reynolds had resigned from his position, effective immediately. The message emphasized that the company was committed to strengthening internal controls and rebuilding trust. Reading that email felt different than the first one. Administrative leave had implied uncertainty. Resignation signaled conclusion. Around the office, reactions were mixed. Some employees expressed quiet relief. Others seemed unsettled, as if witnessing the fall of a high-level executive forced them to confront how fragile authority can be. Emily stopped by my desk later that afternoon and said, "I did not think it would actually go this far." I admitted that I had not known either. What began as a set of questionable numbers had reshaped the leadership structure of our division. That realization carried weight. Later that week, I was invited to meet again with Michael Thompson and the audit team. In the conference room overlooking the skyline, Michael spoke candidly about the importance of internal accountability. He acknowledged that early responses to the issue had not reflected the level of seriousness required, and that the company would be evaluating how concerns are escalated in the future. He thanked me for raising the matter through proper channels and stated that the organization valued employees who act with integrity. The words were formal, but they were clear. I asked directly whether the company planned to review how human resources handled the initial report. Michael nodded and said that all aspects of the response process were under evaluation. It was the first time anyone at that level openly recognized that the initial attempt to contain the issue had been flawed. Walking out of that meeting, I felt a mixture of validation and caution. Validation because the facts had been acknowledged. Caution because corporate memory can be short, and culture does not transform overnight. Over the next several days, colleagues who had previously kept their distance began engaging more openly. A few even shared stories of minor concerns they had once chosen not to report, assuming nothing would change. Hearing that reinforced something I had sensed from the beginning. Silence does not just protect one person. It protects patterns. By the end of the month, the division operated under new financial oversight, revised reporting structures, and a renewed emphasis on compliance. The tension that once defined every hallway conversation had eased, replaced by a cautious professionalism. The situation had not turned into chaos or collapse. Instead, it had forced the organization to confront weaknesses it preferred not to see. As I sat at my desk reviewing updated budget reports under the new system, I understood that the outcome was not about revenge or personal victory. It was about transparency replacing quiet dismissal. And that shift, subtle but undeniable, changed the trajectory of more than just one career. 3 months after the resignation, the office no longer felt like a place divided by quiet tension. The new oversight systems had settled into routine, and the weekly compliance check-ins were treated as standard procedure rather than emergency measures. The interim director was officially appointed to lead the division, and under her leadership the emphasis shifted toward measurable transparency. Expense dashboards were visible to multiple departments. Approvals required dual sign-off. Financial summaries were shared more broadly during monthly reviews. What once felt like guarded information was now treated as shared responsibility. On a practical level, my day-to-day workload returned to normal. I was added back to strategic planning meetings and asked to contribute to long-term forecasting. Mark's tone toward me changed subtly. He was more direct, more respectful. During one one-on-one conversation, he admitted that he had underestimated how serious the discrepancies were at the beginning. He did not apologize in dramatic fashion, but he acknowledged that concerns should be evaluated on their merits rather than their potential inconvenience. That admission mattered. Emily and I occasionally talked about how close the situation had come to being quietly dismissed. She told me she had considered looking for another job before the audit results were announced because she no longer trusted the leadership structure. Now she felt cautiously optimistic. For me, the experience altered something deeper than workplace dynamics. It changed how I viewed institutional authority. I used to assume that systems functioned properly as long as policies existed. What I learned was that policies only have power when individuals choose to enforce them. Integrity is not automatic. It requires action, sometimes uncomfortable action. About a month after the final audit summary was distributed, I received an email from Human Resources announcing updates to the internal reporting process. The message included clearer language about non-retaliation protections and outlined new timelines for escalation reviews. Karen remained in her role, but her approach shifted noticeably. She began hosting open forums where employees could ask questions about compliance without scheduling private meetings. During one session, she publicly stated that early feedback from staff had helped identify weaknesses in their response protocol. She did not mention my name, and I did not expect her to. Recognition was not the point. Structural change was. Financially, my situation remained stable. My rent was still $1,800 a month. My car payment still $420, but the fear that once accompanied those numbers no longer dictated my decisions. Instead, they served as reminders of what had been at stake. I did not receive a promotion immediately, nor did I seek one based on what happened. What I gained was something less visible, but more durable. Credibility. Colleagues began consulting me not just for budget analysis, but for perspective on ethical gray areas. That trust carried weight. One evening, as I left the building and walked across the parking lot under the fading orange light of sunset, I thought back to the moment when I was told to protect my future by remaining silent. At the time, That advice sounded pragmatic, even protective. Now I understood that protecting my future meant something different. It meant aligning my actions with my principles, even when the outcome was uncertain. The company did not collapse. Investors did not withdraw. The sky did not fall. Instead, weaknesses were exposed, policies were strengthened, and leadership recalibrated. The experience did not make me fearless. It made me aware that silence can be more costly than risk. As I started my car and merged onto the freeway, traffic moving steadily at 60 miles per hour, I realized that the most significant change had not occurred in the executive offices or the compliance manuals. It had happened internally. I no longer measured security solely by job stability. I measured it by the ability to look at my own decisions without regret.